Welcome to Sleeponomics, where we explore the quiet forces that shape our world. Stories of transformation, ambition, and resilience, told in a way that helps you slow down, reflect, and rest. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss future journeys like this one. Tonight, we follow the unlikely rise of a global power. In this episode, you'll discover how one of the world's most ancient civilizations became one of its youngest tech superpowers. You'll hear how a sleepy city in southern India turned into the world's outsourcing capital, how government planners, against all odds, sowed the seeds of digital growth, how millions of quiet careers changed the lives of families and the fate of the country, and how India, often underestimated, slowly became essential to the world's digital infrastructure. But none of it happened overnight. There was no moment of triumph, no single breakthrough, only small decisions, quiet movements, and invisible shifts, layer by layer, decade by decade. It begins in Bangalore. Long before the skyscrapers and startup cafes, Bangalore was known for its gardens, old bookstores, and slow afternoons. But in the early 1990s, something started to change. The city filled with a new kind of energy, measured not in noise, but in ambition. Young engineers moved in by the thousands. They worked through the night for clients they would never meet, solving problems on computers they had barely seen growing up. In quiet cubicles and modest buildings, they were helping to build the modern world. India was changing, but few outside noticed, and perhaps that is what makes this story worth telling. It is fascinating to reflect on how history often moves in silence, how the future can begin in small, unnoticed rooms, filled not with power or money, but with quiet effort. Next, we step back in time to post-independence India, and the forgotten beginnings of a digital dream. After India's independence in 1947, the country stood at a quiet crossroads. It had won political freedom, but the economic path ahead was uncertain. The scars of colonial rule ran deep. Industry was underdeveloped, literacy was low, and the idea of building a modern nation from scratch felt both urgent and overwhelming. But amid this landscape of scarcity, a bold vision took root. Jawaharlal Nehru, the country's first prime minister, believed that India's future lay in science, planning, and technical knowledge. Inspired by the Enlightenment and influenced by the success of institutions like MIT and Cambridge, Nehru imagined a new India built not just with votes and laws, but with engineers, physicists, and long-term thinking. It was a quiet kind of ambition. Instead of chasing quick industrial gains, Nehru focused on laying foundations. He championed the creation of the Indian Institutes of Technology, elite schools where some of the brightest minds in the country would be trained in engineering, mathematics, and applied science. These campuses were not just schools, they were symbols of national rebirth. The first IIT opened in Kharagpur in 1951, built on the site of a former British detention camp. Others followed in Bombay, Madras, Kanpur, and Delhi. Each was supported by international partners, Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States, who offered funding, faculty, and curriculum models. In an era of Cold War rivalry, these institutions quietly benefited from global cooperation. Inside the classrooms, students learned in English. They studied electrical engineering, metallurgy, applied physics. But beyond the textbooks, they were part of something deeper, a quiet belief that India could compete on the global stage, not by imitating, but by building its own scientific capacity. Yet for decades, this belief floated in a vacuum. India in the 1950s and 60s had no real software industry. Computers were rare, imported, and expensive. Most graduates went into public sector roles or academic careers. Others left for better prospects abroad. The so-called brain drain became a topic of national debate, yet over time, it laid down invisible bridges. Indian engineers began working in American labs, joining tech companies, and shaping innovations abroad. They were not lost forever. Many would later return or send opportunities home. Meanwhile, back in India, the government slowly began to explore computing. Early efforts included building indigenous computers at institutions like the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. In 1966, the Department of Electronics was created, and state-owned companies like ECIL began experimenting with hardware and mainframes. But the pace was glacial. Computing was still viewed as a support tool, not a transformative force. The private sector, too, remained cautious. Bureaucracy and license restrictions limited imports and discouraged large-scale experimentation. Only a few small firms, like Tata Consultancy Services, began offering software services quietly, almost invisibly, to foreign firms. Still, something subtle was changing. A cultural shift was underway. Engineering became a pathway for upward mobility. Middle-class families began to see technical education not just as a career, but as a ticket to global relevance. Coaching centers opened. Students studied late into the night. Slowly, a nation began preparing for a future it could not yet fully see. It is fascinating to reflect on how economic transformation often begins in places far removed from money. In lecture halls, in family routines, in the soft ambition of everyday people. That is where India's digital dream truly began. Next, we enter the 1980s, a decade of tension and transition. As global technology surged forward, India faced a choice: open up or fall behind. By the early 1980s, India was in a state of quiet unease. The country had grown in population and education, but economically, it was treading water. Industries were inefficient, exports were weak, and a maze of regulations, known as the License Raj, slowed innovation to a crawl. While other nations leaned into the computer age, India remained hesitant. Its policies caught between self-reliance and global participation. But under the surface, small changes were beginning to ripple outward. A few government agencies started experimenting with computerization, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. The Indian Railways, for example, introduced computer-based ticketing in limited zones. The State Bank of India tested internal automation. These were modest steps, but they revealed something important. With the right tools, even India's slow-moving bureaucracy could become more efficient. At the same time, Indian entrepreneurs, most of them working quietly behind the scenes, sensed that change was coming. Tata Consultancy Services, founded in the late 1960s, began writing custom software for Western clients. Infosys, launched in 1981 by a small group of engineers with modest capital, took on similar work. These companies operated in obscurity, often as subcontractors, rarely seen or understood by the broader public. The global context, however, was shifting fast. Western economies were embracing computers. Businesses in the United States, Europe, and Japan needed software, and they needed it fast. But local talent was expensive. Companies began looking for partners elsewhere. India, with its English-speaking engineers and cost advantage, quietly fit the bill. Although infrastructure was weak, power outages were frequent, phone lines unreliable, the talent was undeniable. Western firms began to experiment. Could Indian companies deliver code remotely? The early results were promising, and although bandwidth was limited, creative workarounds emerged. In the early years, Companies flew floppy disks across oceans. Later, they used satellite links, fax machines, and rudimentary data cables. Communication was slow, but it worked. Meanwhile, at home, political tensions were growing. Inflation was rising, debt was building. In 1984, Indira Gandhi was assassinated, throwing the country into grief and uncertainty. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, took office unexpectedly, and though politically inexperienced, he brought a surprising focus: modernization. Rajiv had a background in aviation. He was not a technocrat, but he understood systems. He believed that India needed to join the information age. With quiet urgency, he began dismantling parts of the license Raj. He spoke publicly about the importance of computers. He met with entrepreneurs. He encouraged the formation of software technology parks, small zones with better connectivity and fewer restrictions. It was not yet a revolution, but for the first time, national policy was aligning with private initiative. The idea that India could export software like it exported textiles or tea was no longer far-fetched. It is fascinating to reflect on how turning points often begin as quiet accommodations, not dramatic declarations. A phone call answered late at night, a code snippet faxed across time zones, a government minister who says yes instead of maybe. Next, we witness the breaking point, when India's financial crisis collides with globalization, and a new chapter begins. In 1991, India stood on the edge of economic collapse. The country's foreign exchange reserves had dwindled to the point where it could barely finance 2 weeks of imports. Inflation soared. The government faced growing debt, and political uncertainty made decisive action difficult. It was a quiet but serious emergency, and the world was watching. In response, India turned to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. But that bailout came with conditions. The government was forced to begin dismantling decades of protectionist policies. The license Raj, long seen as a symbol of stability, was now seen as an obstacle. In that moment of necessity, a new path began to emerge. The reforms were led by Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, a soft-spoken economist with international experience. He believed in liberalization, not as ideology, but as survival. Under his leadership, India lowered tariffs, opened up markets, and began to welcome foreign investment. For the first time in decades, entrepreneurship was not something to hide, but something to build around. This shift had ripple effects across the economy, but nowhere were the effects more powerful than in technology. Suddenly, it became easier to import hardware, lease communication lines, and start private companies. The arrival of satellite communications made it possible to send data abroad without needing physical media. Indian software firms, once limited by policy, began to scale up, exporting code, managing databases, and providing 24-hour services to clients in the United States and Europe. Companies like Infosys, Wipro, and TCS began growing rapidly. They opened new campuses, hired aggressively, and trained young graduates in everything from COBOL to client communication. They adopted global quality standards. They created systems to manage time zones, deadlines, and documentation. In short, they professionalized. Yet it was not just the companies that grew. A cultural shift swept across India. Middle-class families began to dream differently. A job in tech meant a steady income, global exposure, and, perhaps most importantly, respect. Young people no longer dreamed only of government posts or academic careers. They began to imagine lives filled with code, clients, and quiet success. The government, seeing the momentum, supported this shift. It established more software technology parks, special zones where firms could operate with better connectivity and fewer restrictions. These parks became magnets for global contracts. A quiet export revolution had begun, not in goods but in services. It is fascinating to reflect on how crises, though painful, often become catalysts. Without the currency collapse of 1991, it is unlikely that India would have embraced liberalization so quickly. And without liberalization, the country's software revolution may have taken decades longer to emerge. Next, we step into the new millennium when India's tech story moves from back office to global boardroom. By the mid-1990s, India's software industry was no longer a quiet experiment. It had become a growing part of the country's economic fabric, employing tens of thousands of workers and attracting consistent foreign contracts. But it was still largely invisible to the average person. Software was written behind closed doors, in nondescript buildings, for distant clients whose names rarely appeared in the news. It was quiet work, and yet, it was reshaping India's global identity. At the center of this transformation was not a sudden invention or a single company. It was a shift in trust. In the early days of outsourcing, foreign clients were skeptical. Could a company halfway across the world truly understand their needs? Could Indian engineers working from a different time zone and culture deliver software at scale and with quality? These were not technical questions. They were questions of relationship, and Indian companies understood this. Firms like Infosys, TCS, and Wipro began to place extraordinary emphasis on client communication. They hired staff not just for programming skills, but for their ability to write reports, follow documentation, and understand foreign business etiquette. Many trained their employees in American English, time management, and cultural awareness. Offices adapted to client time zones, with teams working through the night to ensure real-time coordination. This discipline paid off. Projects delivered on time, under budget, and with high reliability. Slowly, foreign clients stopped thinking of Indian firms as mere vendors and began treating them as partners. The global tech boom of the late 1990s accelerated this shift. As Western companies rushed to expand their digital presence, they needed large teams of capable, affordable developers. India fit the need perfectly. Engineers were young, motivated, and trained in global languages and standards. More importantly, they were trusted. The year 2000 offered both a test and an opportunity. As the Y2K crisis loomed, the fear that old software systems would fail at the turn of the millennium, hundreds of companies turned to India. It was not glamorous work. It involved combing through millions of lines of legacy code to fix date-related errors. But it was urgent, technical, and sensitive. Indian firms responded with precision. Thousands of engineers worked long hours under tight deadlines. The world did not fall apart on January 1st, 2000. And in the aftermath, India's reputation was stronger than ever. It had proven itself not just competent, but dependable. That trust, earned quietly, became a kind of currency. Meanwhile, back in India, the software boom began to change cityscapes and family lives. New office parks emerged on the edges of cities. Young professionals, many of them first-generation white-collar workers, found themselves living in furnished apartments, commuting by shuttle, and receiving paychecks larger than their parents had imagined possible. English language training centers boomed. Private schools filled up. Real estate prices soared in places like Bangalore and Hyderabad. At the same time, a new idea began to take hold. What if India didn't just serve global companies, but built global companies? Infosys went public on the Nasdaq in 1999, becoming the first Indian company listed there. Its success was a cultural milestone. Indian business leaders were suddenly on the covers of global magazines. The IT parks became aspirational destinations. For many young Indians, software was no longer just a job, it was an identity. It is fascinating to reflect on how deeply trust shapes global commerce. It is built slowly through consistency, responsiveness, and quiet excellence. And once earned, it opens doors that no amount of advertising or lobbying can buy. Next, we enter the post-dot-com era, where India's firms, once seen as support providers, begin to design, lead, and innovate on the global stage. By the early 2000s, India's reputation as a global service hub was firmly established. Its engineers powered banking systems in London, maintained telecom networks in Canada, and wrote back-end code for retailers in Germany. But beneath this layer of operational excellence, a new question quietly emerged. Could India do more than execute? Could it innovate? This was not just a matter of technology, it was a matter of mindset. For decades, Indian firms had thrived on doing precise, reliable work for others. They delivered code, managed systems, and resolved problems efficiently, predictably, and often invisibly. But they rarely set the direction. The strategies came from elsewhere. That began to change. The first sign was subtle. Indian IT companies started offering not just technical services, but business consulting. They began hiring professionals with backgrounds in finance, logistics, and operations. People who could sit with clients, understand organizational challenges, and propose integrated solutions. This marked a quiet shift from service provider to thought partner. Firms like Infosys launched consulting divisions. TCS built proprietary platforms for sectors like insurance and retail. Wipro expanded into high-end systems integration. These moves were not headlines, but they were meaningful. Indian firms were no longer just building someone else's vision, they were shaping it. At the same time, Western companies began to shift more core functions offshore. What started as simple back-end tasks now included software architecture, design decisions, and entire project ownership. For the first time, Indian engineers were leading global development teams. They managed budgets, set timelines, and made product decisions. This was most visible in captive centers, foreign companies setting up dedicated R&D units in India. Microsoft, Intel, IBM, Oracle, and Google all established large campuses, not just for cost savings, but for talent. These centers were not performing routine maintenance. They were designing chips, developing operating systems, and exploring cloud infrastructure. As confidence grew, Indian firms also began to develop their own intellectual property. Infosys launched Finacle, a banking platform used globally. TCS introduced its own analytics tools. Startups began emerging in spaces like enterprise software, health tech, and mobile applications. Though still early, these signs pointed to a future where India would not just power the digital economy, it would help define it. Culturally, this shift was profound. In the 1990s, the idea of working in software often meant long hours of quiet, behind-the-scenes coding. By the mid-2000s, it meant something broader. Tech professionals were now product managers, consultants, and innovation leads. Their work was no longer invisible, it was strategic. This evolution also changed education. Indian universities expanded their offerings in design, data science, and management. Private institutions launched specialized programs in UX, product strategy, and artificial intelligence. For students, the dream was no longer just a stable job. It was leadership, invention, and global relevance. It is fascinating to reflect on how quiet competence can evolve into vision. By earning trust through execution, Indian tech firms gained the permission and the confidence to lead. They did not ask to change the world. They simply prepared, delivered, and waited for the moment to widen their role. Next, we explore the rise of India's startup ecosystem and how a new generation began writing its own digital future. By the late 2000s, India's technology sector was firmly embedded in the global economy. Large firms like Infosys and TCS had become household names, and multinational companies operated sprawling campuses in cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad. But while this ecosystem brought scale, stability, and foreign investment, it left one question quietly unanswered. Where was the invention? The answer came not from boardrooms, but from bedrooms, dormitories, and internet cafes. A new generation of Indians, raised on broadband, mobile phones, and ambition, began to imagine something different. They didn't want to just support global platforms. They wanted to build their own. The Indian startup movement did not arrive with fanfare. It began with frustration. Online shopping in India was clumsy. Payments were unreliable. Travel booking required visits to physical agencies. Young consumers, increasingly connected through smartphones, wanted the same digital convenience they saw in the West, but tailored to Indian realities. Enter Flipkart. Founded in 2007 by two former Amazon employees, Flipkart began as a modest online bookstore. The idea was simple: replicate Amazon's model, but for Indian customers. But the challenges were not. India lacked reliable warehousing, shipping, and payment infrastructure. Customers did not trust online transactions. Credit card usage was limited. Deliveries often got lost. So Flipkart adapted. It introduced cash on delivery, a model that allowed customers to pay only when the package arrived. It built its own logistics network, creating fulfillment centers and courier services. It invested heavily in customer service, ensuring refunds and returns were handled quickly. And slowly, it worked. By 2012, Flipkart was one of India's most trusted digital brands. It no longer just sold books. It sold phones, clothing, electronics, and household goods. It had helped create a new behavior: Indians shopping online, not as an exception, but as a routine. Around the same time, Ola emerged in the transportation space. Urban traffic was worsening. Taxi services were unreliable. Inspired by Uber, but shaped by local needs, Ola introduced a flexible ride-hailing system that worked with India's fragmented car ownership model. It added auto rickshaws. It introduced in-app cash payments. It localized. In education, Byju's took a similar approach, using video, animation, and adaptive technology to help students prepare for India's competitive exams. Its reach extended from elite prep centers to rural mobile screens. In doing so, it reimagined what digital education could look like in a country with vast linguistic, regional, and economic diversity. These were not copy-paste startups. They were deeply local innovations, designed not in imitation, but in response. Their success sparked hundreds of others: health tech platforms like Practo, payment systems like Paytm, food delivery from Zomato and Swiggy. Each one tackled a real-world inefficiency. Each one proved that Indian problems could be solved by Indian solutions. The government, once slow to adapt, began to take notice. It launched Startup India in 2016, offering tax breaks, simplified regulations, and public platforms for funding. More importantly, it embraced digital infrastructure. The introduction of Aadhaar, a national biometric ID, enabled easier KYC processes. The Unified Payments Interface, UPI, turned mobile phones into bank terminals. Suddenly, building a startup was no longer an elite ambition. It became an accessible path. It is fascinating to reflect on how creativity often begins with constraint. India's startups were not born in perfect conditions. They were built amid unreliable power, patchy networks, and bureaucratic delays. But in navigating these obstacles, they discovered something powerful: scale. India's problems were not small, but that meant that solving them, quietly, precisely, locally, could touch millions of lives. Next, we examine how India's tech rise shifted outward, transforming not just its cities, but its global image. By the early 2010s, India's tech sector had reached a point of quiet maturity. Its software giants were global players. Its startup ecosystem was thriving. Its engineers were no longer just supporting products. They were building them, scaling them, and leading them. But something else began to shift during this period. India's relationship with the global digital economy was no longer one of reception. It was becoming one of projection. For decades, Indian tech firms had operated on a model of inbound opportunity. Global clients brought work to India. Foreign companies set up R&D centers in Indian cities. The direction of flow was clear, but by the mid-2000s teens, that direction began to bend outward. The first signs came through global acquisitions. In 2013, Infosys acquired Lodestone, a Swiss consulting firm. In 2016, Wipro purchased Aperio, a US-based cloud services company. These moves were not just about scale. They signaled a strategic intent. Indian firms wanted more than contracts. They wanted global presence, intellectual property, and customer relationships rooted in the West. But it was not just large firms expanding abroad. Indian entrepreneurs, too, began launching companies aimed directly at global markets. SaaS, software as a service, became the new frontier. Products like Zoho, Freshworks, and Postman gained traction internationally. They offered clean interfaces, efficient support, and competitive pricing. More importantly, they proved that a company headquartered in Chennai or Hyderabad could sell software to Berlin, Boston, or Brisbane. Freshworks became a symbol of this shift. Founded in 2010 in Chennai, it offered customer engagement tools for small businesses. It grew steadily, quietly, and globally. In 2021, Freshworks went public on the NASDAQ, raising over $1 billion. It was the first Indian SaaS company to list in the US. And unlike the IT giants before it, Freshworks was not serving global clients. It was competing with them. This was a new chapter. India was no longer just exporting labor or services. It was exporting products, platforms, and ideas. At the same time, Indian startups began expanding into neighboring regions. Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa became natural growth zones, markets with similar infrastructural gaps, mobile-first populations, and regulatory complexity. Indian firms brought lessons learned from home and adapted them to new contexts. Fintech models tested in Uttar Pradesh now found use in Kenya. Logistics systems born in Delhi were deployed in Jakarta. Government policy helped reinforce this shift. India's diplomatic and trade relationships increasingly emphasize technology cooperation. Startup India's global arm began hosting roadshows abroad. Indian entrepreneurs received access to foreign venture capital, often through Silicon Valley connections built over decades. Indian origin executives were also becoming more prominent on the world stage. Sundar Pichai at Google, Satya Nadella at Microsoft, Arvind Krishna at IBM. These figures, while American citizens, symbolized the growing influence of Indian thought in global technology leadership. Their backgrounds reminded the world that Indian talent was not just abundant, it was shaping the digital agenda. Meanwhile, India itself was becoming a testbed for innovation. Global firms began to pilot new products in India before launching elsewhere. Facebook tested mobile payments. Amazon built rural delivery models. Google optimized for low bandwidth search. The assumption had flipped. India was no longer behind. It was ahead in solving for the next billion users. It is fascinating to reflect on how global influence rarely begins with declarations. It often starts with quiet relevance, when your tools, your thinking, your pace become useful to others. India's digital presence was becoming just that: useful, adaptable, respected. Next, we explore how this outward momentum fused with internal ambition, leading to a phase of national platforms, digital public goods, and a new kind of infrastructure thinking. By the late 2010s, India had entered a new phase of its digital journey. It had moved beyond servicing foreign clients, beyond exporting talent, and even beyond scaling startups. A quiet but profound shift was underway. The building of digital infrastructure, not for corporations, but for citizens. This was not just about apps or platforms. It was about architecture. In most countries, digital infrastructure is driven by private enterprise. In India, a different model emerged, one built around the concept of public digital goods. These were systems not owned by a single company, but available to all. They offered a base layer on which private innovation could flourish. And at the heart of this model was Aadhaar. Launched in 2009, Aadhaar was a bold experiment. It aimed to give every Indian a unique biometric identity, linked to fingerprints, iris scans, and a 12-digit number. The goal was simple but radical: to ensure that everyone, regardless of birth or location, could be digitally recognized. For a country with over 1 billion people and a long history of bureaucratic opacity, this was transformative. At first, Aadhaar was controversial. Concerns about privacy, data misuse, and surveillance loomed large. But over time, the system proved its utility. It enabled more accurate delivery of government subsidies. It allowed poor families to open bank accounts. It reduced fraud. By the end of the decade, over 90% of Indians had enrolled. But Aadhaar was only the beginning. Layered atop it came UPI, the Unified Payments Interface. Developed by the National Payments Corporation of India, UPI allowed anyone with a smartphone and a bank account to send and receive money instantly, at no cost. No need for credit cards, bank branches, or elaborate verification. With just a few taps, a street vendor in Jaipur could receive a payment from a customer in Mumbai. UPI did not emerge from Silicon Valley. It was not created for profit, and yet, it quickly became one of the world's most successful payment platforms, handling billions of transactions per month. Its openness encouraged adoption by private players. Google Pay, PhonePe, Paytm, all operated on UPI rails. This ecosystem drove down transaction costs and democratized digital commerce. Together, Aadhaar and UPI formed the backbone of what came to be known as the India Stack, a set of interoperable digital layers designed for scale, inclusion, and innovation. Other components followed: DigiLocker for digital documents, eKYC for instant identity verification, and account aggregators for financial data management. This was a new kind of infrastructure, not made of concrete or steel, but of code and trust. It did not replace physical systems, it enabled them. Farmers could receive subsidies directly. Students could access records remotely. Health data could move across platforms securely, and entrepreneurs could build applications atop these rails, serving niche audiences without massive overhead. What made this model unique was its intent. It did not seek to monopolize attention or extract profit from every interaction. Instead, it sought to lower the cost of trust, to make digital participation cheap, fast, and fair. In doing so, it created one of the world's most inclusive digital ecosystems. It is fascinating to reflect on how true infrastructure often hides in plain sight. We see roads and power lines, but we rarely see the software that lets a pensioner receive funds on a mobile phone, or a rural clinic access health records instantly. In India, that invisible layer was being quietly built, line by line, login by login. And unlike many digital initiatives elsewhere, India's platforms were open by design. Anyone could build atop them, startups, corporates, even foreign firms. This openness sparked a new wave of entrepreneurship, focused not just on profit, but on public value. Digital credit for small shops, remote diagnostics for rural clinics, legal aid platforms. These were not global unicorns, but they mattered. Next, we turn to the final phase of India's tech evolution, where the country's digital momentum meets the challenges of regulation, inequality, and global power. As India's digital infrastructure expanded, so too did its influence. UPI processed billions of transactions. Aadhaar became a near-universal ID. Startups built on these foundations were reaching every corner of the country, from metro cities to remote villages. India had become, in many ways, the most connected democracy in the world. But with this scale came a new set of challenges. Quietly, behind the scenes, a battle was beginning. Not between companies, but between ideals. How do you regulate a digital society? Who owns data? Who controls the rails? In the early years, India had taken a light-touch approach to digital governance. Innovation was encouraged. Platforms were open. Regulations were minimal. This fostered explosive growth, but also brought tension. Foreign companies, flush with capital, began to dominate market share. American firms led in search, video, messaging, and cloud infrastructure. Chinese apps surged in entertainment and commerce. Indian startups competed, but often from behind. The government took notice. In 2016, a quiet pivot began. The Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology started drafting new data protection policies. The question at the center was simple but significant. Should Indian citizens' data remain within Indian borders? This idea, data localization, sparked debate across industries. Supporters argued it would protect privacy and sovereignty. Critics warned of rising costs and global fragmentation. At the same time, India began rethinking its relationship with major platforms. In 2020, amid geopolitical tensions, the government banned over 50 Chinese apps, citing security concerns. This included TikTok, which had tens of millions of Indian users. The decision was swift, surprising, and symbolically powerful. India was no longer just building infrastructure. It was defending it. Social media regulation followed. Platforms were asked to remove content within specific time frames. New rules required appointment of compliance officers within India. Encryption policies faced scrutiny. The government sought transparency, accountability, and local oversight. In response, some global firms resisted, others adapted. But the message was clear. India would not remain a passive digital consumer. It intended to govern its own digital space. These shifts were not loud. They did not dominate headlines for long, but they marked a deeper transformation. India was no longer navigating technology as a newcomer. It was shaping it as a sovereign actor, balancing innovation, openness, and national interest. Meanwhile, Indian regulators faced another challenge: market concentration. As platforms scaled, questions of monopoly began to surface. A handful of companies controlled vast amounts of user data, financial flows, and communication channels. Startups found it harder to compete. Consumers had few alternatives. In response, India explored platform neutrality. The Open Network for Digital Commerce, ONDC, was launched as a quiet counterbalance to large e-commerce firms. Its goal, to create an open, interoperable infrastructure for online retail, much like UPI had done for payments. Sellers, buyers, logistics providers, and payment platforms could interact freely without being locked into proprietary ecosystems. ONDC was not a reaction. It was a principle, a belief that digital markets should serve the many, not the few. And though still early, its development signaled a new regulatory vision: proactive, constructive, and quietly assertive. Privacy also moved into focus. The Personal Data Protection Bill, years in the making, underwent multiple revisions. At its heart lay the idea that data belonged not to governments or companies, but to individuals. Consent, access, and redress became central tenets. The law was complex, contested, and incomplete. But it marked an evolution. Regulation was no longer reactive. It was strategic. It is fascinating to reflect on how digital maturity changes the tone of a nation's decisions. In earlier chapters, India asked how to connect its people. Now, it asked how to protect them. The questions had shifted from how fast to how fair, from enabling access to ensuring dignity. Next, we move into India's present moment, a country balancing scale and ethics, growth and restraint, global ambition, and local integrity. In the second half of the 2010s, India's digital rise began to carry geopolitical weight. What had started as a quiet journey of talent, infrastructure, and entrepreneurship was now intersecting with the larger currents of global power. The internet was no longer just a space of commerce and communication. It had become an arena of strategy. At the heart of this shift was a growing global realization. Digital systems, payment rails, cloud servers, messaging platforms, identity databases were not neutral. They shaped economies, influenced politics, and revealed new vulnerabilities. As the world split into competing tech spheres, India found itself in a complex but unique position. On one side stood the United States, home to the most influential technology companies: Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft. These platforms were deeply embedded in Indian life, powering search, enabling payments, hosting video, and storing data. On the other side stood China, once a major provider of affordable digital tools and apps, now increasingly shut out of Indian markets due to rising security concerns. In this landscape, most countries lean toward one pole or the other. India chose something different: digital non-alignment. This was not a formal policy. It was a quiet pattern, a series of decisions that reflected strategic ambiguity. India welcomed foreign capital, but insisted on local control. It embraced global platforms, but demanded regulatory compliance. It partnered with the West on technology standards, but retained its right to ban apps, enforce data rules, and build sovereign systems. This approach had historical roots. During the Cold War, India famously pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, refusing to join military blocs and seeking independent partnerships. In the digital age, a similar instinct re-emerged to balance openness with autonomy. One of the clearest expressions of this was India's growing investment in homegrown alternatives. After banning TikTok, Indian developers launched similar short-form video apps, Moj, Chingari, Josh. While none matched TikTok's scale, they offered proof that domestic demand could sustain indigenous platforms. In payments, UPI provided a public alternative to proprietary fintech. In commerce, ONDC challenged platform lock-in. India also began shaping international digital discussions. It pushed for data sovereignty at the G20. It engaged with African and Southeast Asian nations on digital public infrastructure. It offered Aadhaar-like systems as templates for digital inclusion in other developing countries. Quietly, it was exporting its model, not for profit, but as a soft power asset. This model was built on two beliefs: that digital capacity should not mean digital dependence, and that trust, infrastructure-level trust, should be public, not privatized. The world took notice. Development agencies began studying the India stack. Policy circles in Washington and Brussels discussed UPI. World Bank reports cited India's role in digital financial inclusion. India was no longer just a case study. It was becoming a contributor. Meanwhile, Indian origin leaders in global firms, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Arvind Krishna, gave voice to a kind of hybrid vision, rooted in Indian education, shaped by Western markets, and globally fluent. Their presence reinforced the idea that India was not on the periphery of digital change. It was helping write its code. It is fascinating to reflect on how quiet independence can carry power. In a world of sharp alignments, India's digital stance offered something subtler: selective engagement, layered openness, a refusal to be boxed in. But this balancing act was not without tension. Foreign investors wanted predictability. Local startups sought protection. Citizens demanded both innovation and accountability. The government had to mediate between global capital, national interests, and individual rights, all within a fast-moving digital landscape. And yet, India persisted. It did not close its doors. It did not surrender its voice. Instead, it walked a quiet path. Complex, adaptive, sometimes contradictory, but deeply intentional. Next, we arrive at the end of this journey, where India's decades-long evolution meets the uncertain road ahead. One shaped not just by technology, but by values. It began with something small: a policy, a classroom, a contract, no headlines, no disruption, just quiet effort. Repeated, refined, and scaled over decades. India's rise as a global tech power was not a story of flash or force. It was a story of quiet systems, of decisions made not to impress, but to endure. A nation with deep complexity and uneven infrastructure found a way to organize trust at scale. In doing so, it reshaped both itself and the way the world understood digital development. Looking back, the journey feels unlikely. In the 1950s, India was a newly independent country focused on agriculture and heavy industry. It had limited capital, low literacy, and scarce computers. And yet, its leaders invested in technical education, built elite institutions, and nurtured a scientific mindset, not for short-term gain, but as an act of belief. In the 1980s, a small group of engineers started writing code for distant clients. They worked through power outages, with unreliable phone lines and little visibility. No one imagined that within a generation, those modest offices would evolve into global campuses, or that Indian software would touch nearly every corner of the modern economy. Then came the 1990s. A financial crisis forced the country to liberalize. Foreign firms arrived, markets opened, talent flooded in. But instead of just following others, Indian companies developed their own culture of delivery, precise, humble, and deeply customer-focused. They earned trust, and trust became leverage. The 2000s brought scale, the Y2K moment, the IT boom, the rise of Infosys, Wipro, and TCS, but also the birth of a startup ecosystem, one that would not just respond to foreign demand, but create local solutions. Flipkart for commerce, Ola for mobility, Byju's for education. Then came the platforms, Aadhaar, UPI, India Stack, public infrastructure for digital identity, payments, and services. Not built to extract data or lock users in, but to lower the cost of participation, to help 1 billion people join the digital age without leaving them behind. And then, as foreign companies scaled, India regulated with quiet intention, not to isolate, but to balance, to remain open but not exposed. All of it, quiet, no conquest narrative, no unicorn parade, just consistent, patient infrastructure building, guided by a quiet belief that technology is not an end, but a tool, and that digital development, if done right, is not loud, it is lived. Today, India stands at a unique intersection. It is one of the largest digital societies in the world. It exports software, shapes standards, leads global platforms. Its executives head major companies. Its engineers build core systems. Its platforms inspire others. But the journey is not over. Questions remain. How will India protect privacy while scaling inclusion? How will it prevent monopolies while fostering innovation? How will it manage AI, data governance, and cyber risk in a way that reflects both global ambition and local needs? No country has solved these perfectly, but India brings something valuable to the table: its willingness to experiment, to build slowly, and to think infrastructurally, not just commercially. It is fascinating to reflect on how power often arrives without noise. In India's case, it arrived in forms most people never see: digital IDs, invisible transactions, cloud-native registries, API layers. Not glamorous, not disruptive, but vital. A silent transformation. And perhaps that is the story of India's rise. Not a sprint, not a spectacle, but a steady ascent, guided by engineers, shaped by policy, scaled by patience. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration, Sleeponomics offers many more stories to accompany your rest. Feel free to subscribe, and until next time, sleep well.